two young men ignore the warnings of a haunted valley and set off on a journey through the forests near Greenburgh, New York. What they encounter there defies explanation, leaving them and many others gripped by a terror they couldn't escape. Was it a ghost, a demon, or something even stranger? Join me as we delve into this chilling little-known incident from the 1770s, a case which you will see has eerie parallels to more recent eyewitness accounts. I'm Peter Lawson, and I suggest you wrap up warm because you're about to be trapped in the haunted forest of Greenburgh. Elliot O'Donnell was an English ghost hunter and author. Born in 1872, he died in 1965, and during that time he wrote more than 50 books on themes of the occult and the paranormal. After studying in England and Ireland, he headed out to America for a while. He worked on a ranch in Oregon and also gave some support to the police force during a railway strike in 1894. It was during that summer of 1894 when O'Donnell was traveling westwards across America. On his journey, he stopped off in Denver, the capital city of Colorado. During that one-week stay, this young man became acquainted with an elderly church minister. His name was Reverend William Smith. As well as his religious pursuits, Reverend Smith took a keen interest in the paranormal stories of America, and he was well versed in various supernatural cases that had been reported throughout the country. Even at this younger age, Edward O'Donnell loved these topics too, and so he and Reverend Smith made a quick connection with one another. And during this week in Denver, the two men would spend time discussing hauntings and strange occurrences. Well, one evening, the two men were talking alone when the Reverend shared a genuinely disturbing story. A story that struck O'Donnell so much that he wrote it down, and he later published it in a book called The Screaming Skulls from 1964, which came out a year before O'Donnell died. The case occurred around a place called Greenburgh, which is a town in Westchester County, New York. Now, this area already has something of a haunted history. The famous village of Sleepy Hollow is nearby, known for Washington Irving's classic ghost story with a man who gets decapitated by a cannonball and returns as a headless horseman ghost. The legend of Sleepy Hollow came out in 1820, but Reverend Smith's account was much earlier. It came from the 1770s, and this was not claimed to be a story, but an actual series of eyewitness accounts to a true horror in the woods. The case involved two young men called Herbert Hall and Walter Wren. They lived in America, but their ancestry was Dutch. Many people in the Hudson Valley region have a Dutch heritage. The region used to be called New Netherland. Well, the two men were moving through this area, heading for Greenburgh. They were going to be staying there that night. But it was now the afternoon, and they needed to eat on their journey. And so they stopped at a little village on the shores of the Hudson River. They found the village inn and headed inside for food. While there, they asked the landlord for directions to Greenburgh, and the landlord was very happy to help. He said there were actually two routes to get from the inn to Greenburgh. One was the short way, and the other the long. But he said that since it was getting later in the day, it'd be better to take the long route. That would be safer. Now, Walter Wren wasn't keen on taking the long route, so he asked him straight out, "What's so bad about taking the short path? Is it the road really rough or something?" He waited for a moment, and then the landlord replied. He said, "Look, there is a valley about a mile from Greenburgh, and frankly, it's got a bad reputation." Now, let me interject here. O'Donnell's account refers to this valley as Greenburgh Valley, but as I look at the maps, I'm pretty sure that he is referring to Sawmill River Valley that runs through parts of Greenburgh. In the 18th century, places were often referenced after names of nearby towns. But whatever the case, the landlord was saying that this valley had a bad reputation, and so the two men naturally pressed to ask the reason why. Finally came out with it. He said, "Look, folks around here think that part of that forest valley is haunted." This was the point where the two men almost spat out their food in laughter. "Haunted," they said. "Are you serious?" He was dead serious. Well, the two men just sat there giggling to themselves and started mocking the landlord. One of them said, "So you actually believe in ghosts?" The landlord did believe, as did many people back then. The Dutch settlers in the Hudson Valley brought traditions of folklore and ghost stories, and plus there were the colonial superstitions and religious fears about evil forces lurking in the forest, the threat of witches, the brooding sense of paranormal threat. And so the landlord must have been horrified by what Herbert Hall said next. He said, "I've always wanted to see a ghost." Now, there may be some of you who would have said the same thing in this situation, being enthusiasts and explorers of spooky things. Well, Herbert Hall started quizzing the landlord on the history of the valley. What's the story of the place? Why do they say it's haunted? What's the ghost? Did someone die on the road? Was there a murder? The landlord just listened to this and shrugged, saying, "Look, a lot of strange things have happened in that place, but I'm not going to tell you because you two are obviously just going to laugh at me. I'm going to tell you later what those things are, those events he referenced, and they are frightening, but he didn't tell Hall and Wren at that point, and so I want you to be in their shoes." And so he didn't go into detail about the haunted valley's history because of their mockery. Instead, he just got back to the directions and told them how to go the long, safe way, and also, since they insisted, the shorter, haunted route. Hall and Wren thanked them for his help, but they were open about defying his advice. They told him straight out, "We're heading the short path." Not only would they get to their destination quicker, they reasoned, they believed that traveling that way would be far more adventurous and fun. And if they did meet some spectre on the lonely pathway, they told the landlord that they would challenge it. The landlord watched them, full of bravado as they gathered up their knapsacks, strapping them to their backs. They gave him a wave goodbye and headed out to follow the trail. And as the door opened, the landlord would have noticed that the wind was picking up and the afternoon sunlight was already starting to fade. The Greenburgh area has undergone significant development since the 1770s. It's transformed into a suburban community with residential neighborhoods and commercial hubs. There's still green spaces, of course, like Hartsbrook Park and the Greenburgh Nature Center. But you have to get your mindset back to the 18th century when the region would have been swamped by dense forests and untamed wilderness. And so the two men made their way into this wilderness. And after following the landlord's directions, they soon found themselves at the top of a hill. Now from here, they could see the sun was starting to fade for sure. Twilight was coming in, but they could still take in the view. They could see the wooded valley they were set to walk through. It stretched out for a significant distance ahead. They saw the tips of the trees swaying and shaking and leaning with the wind that was growing stronger and stronger. So the path ahead looked dramatic and ominous, but they were still glad to have chosen this route. And so they started to descend the hill towards the tree line. Every step downwards, they started to notice something odd. It was quiet, remarkably so. Now sure, they were shifting from day to evening, and so the birds would start to quiet down. But at this time of the afternoon, birds and sparrows will often still sing, briefly, their last chorus of the day. There also would be the gradual emerging of nocturnal creatures, the toads, the frogs, the crickets near the river and in the trees. Raccoons and deer and foxes even might start stirring around this time. So the approach of evening hardly means that a forest falls silent. Yet as the two men walked down the hill, they were struck by this gaunt quiet that seemed to hang in the trees at the bottom of the slope. They heard little more than the crack of branches underfoot and their now slightly nervous breathing. And then suddenly, two of them noticed something else. "Where has the wind gone?" one of them asked. Now sure enough, back on the hill just moments ago, there was a very forceful breeze pushing at them and the trees. But now they were down here, even that had vanished along with the sounds of the forest. They started to realize that this might not be anything paranormal, but rather this valley route must be so deep that the lower they headed down the hill, the more the wind was passing somewhere above them. Hall and Wren weren't freaked out, by the way, at this, at least not yet. They would be. Instead, right now, they were finding this all awe-inspiring, and they were so taken by the power of this place that they both kept quiet as they continued their decline down the hill and into the valley. They were enjoying the wonderful stillness of the place. Well, after a while, the two men felt the slope even out. The pressure in their knees changed as they moved onto flatter ground. and they had now fully entered the valley. And it was then that they realized that the time must be much later than they thought. Or at least these thick trees were blocking out the twilight, because the forest had turned seriously dark. It was as if night had fallen within a minute or two. Herbert Hall looked around at the thick shadows and made a joke. He said, "This must be the haunted glen. Pretty cheerful, isn't it?" And Wren joked back, "It is." But of course, neither of them really felt it was that pleasant. It felt strange here already. Not in a good way. Walter Wren said, "Come on, we need to get going. I vote we get out of this as soon as we possibly can." And so they started to speed up. They were hurrying through the thick trunks and watching trees, trying to watch their step in the darkness. Now this went on for a while until they reached a spot that seemed different from the rest. It was more open with less trees, and they realized that they had reached a crossroads of sorts. But the darkness here was even more intense. This presented a slight problem because the woods were so dark now that they became worried they might become disorientated and end up walking in the wrong direction. And so they deliberately started to slow down their walking to make sure they didn't take the wrong turn in their haste. And it was while they slowed in this area that they first got the inkling that they were not alone in the woods. Someone or something was in the darkness with them. The two men had to strain their eyes to see through the thick shadows. But as they moved slowly and cautiously through the woods, both of them became aware of some kind of activity ahead of them. Something they didn't know was moving up there through the darkness. Now, was it an animal or another traveler perhaps? They couldn't tell, it was just so dark. But the more they walked, the more they knew something was moving through the shadows. And the more they walked, the more the presence became discernible. They started to see a very tall shape in the moving blackness. You know what it's like when you see something in thick blackness? It doesn't just suddenly appear, it fades in a little. And gradually their vision began to adjust. The shadows started to soften and the indistinct outline of something emerged, but it was still painted in shades of charcoal and midnight. In the blackness, they started to see a gradual silhouette of what looked like a tall man, though something seemed very, very off about him. You see, he was walking in front of them at a similar pace to them, and yet what shocked them was that this stranger was walking with what O'Donnell puts as immensely long strides. It's strange, isn't it, how the tiniest of alterations to a human's movements can put us on edge. Well, Hall and Wren were disturbed by this walking gait that this stranger had, and they decided they simply had to quicken their pace to overtake the fellow traveler, to get him in the rear headlights so they could get ahead. But as they sped up, they were even more startled by what started happening. They weren't very far from him, yet no matter how much they sped up their pace, they couldn't catch up with this figure in the darkness. Without seeming to increase his speed, he yet maintained invariably the same distance away from them. Now, Hall and Wren were keen to get out of this forest, and they weren't going to turn back. So when they realized they couldn't catch up with this fella, they just kept walking behind the stranger, surprised that he never turned round to notice them. At this point, they didn't feel ready to call out to him. Suddenly, they noticed that the figure up ahead turned to start walking along a roadway. And when they reached that part of the road, they realized that that was the direction in which they should also go. And so they too began heading down this road, following this figure, essentially. It was around then that Herbert Hall decided to say something, to break the strange tension of the moment. And he called out up along the trail. He shouted, "Hello there! Who are you?" The striding, tall figure, who again was barely visible, made no response at all. There wasn't a turning, a gesture of awareness or acknowledgement. It just kept striding at the same strange rate as before, keeping the same distance from them at all times. It was really peculiar. That wasn't the only odd thing either. You see, when Hall shouted out, the two men were suddenly struck by how jarring the sound of Hall's voice was, and they were reminded in that moment of how silent the forest still was, which made them realize that the figure in front of them was making no sound with his footsteps. This was extremely unusual, because both men said that the silence of the forest had rendered their hearing to be abnormally acute. And yet, while they could clearly hear the sound of their own feet tramping along the forest road, they couldn't hear anything else in the forest, and nothing at all from the traveller ahead. Now, both men later admitted that it was at this precise moment when they each began to feel a genuine sense of unease creeping in. Yet neither of them wanted to admit it to each other because they were too stubborn and proud. At this point, we should talk a little bit about psychology. You see, there is a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. It's when people mistakenly believe that everyone else in a group feels differently than they do. And so they go along with what they think the group wants, not realizing that others might secretly share the same opinion or feeling. Classic example of this is, imagine a group goes out for drinks in a pub or a bar, and someone at the end of the night suggests, let's go to a nightclub. One person might think, I can't be bothered, I don't want to, I'd rather stay here or head home. But they assume everyone else is excited about the nightclub, and so they act like they're excited too. And everyone ends up wearing a mask, pretending they're on board, when in reality, many might feel the same reluctance. And so you have a situation where a bunch of people go to a nightclub when hardly any of them actually want to go. That is what was happening here in the forest. These two men, embarrassed about feeling scared, later admitted that they were actively trying to appear calm and unconcerned in front of the other. Thinking the other wasn't scared, they felt the need to act brave too, but in reality their bravery was just a mask. This mutual illusion of fearlessness went on for a while. And I think this kind of dynamic where people feed off each other's pretenses happens more often than we might realize, and it might even help explain why some people stick around in paranormal situations longer than we might expect, because some people are just too scared to admit how truly frightened they are in the moment, and others follow that example. But the reality is, everyone is scared. And so Herbert Hall and Walter Wren just kept trekking onwards, despite their secret fear. And at this point, the forest remained very dark indeed, so they could still not really make out the details of the figure. They said it was more like a smooth black silhouette walking before them. Then something unexpected happened. The figure in front of them, suddenly and without any warning, swerved off the road, and they watched it striding through an area of the forest that was better lit, because an opening in the tree line had caused some of the moonlight to wash over the area. And in the dull blue glow, they could see a wooden gate and a gravel drive. That drive led to a property out there in the valley, a rather substantial property called White Grange, and we'll hear more about that building later. But for now, the two men just realized that the dark, shadowy figure was swerving off the road and walking quickly towards the gate of this White Grange house. And this was the moment where their unease shifted into pure shock. Because finally, the other walker had stepped out of the thick shadows and into the open stretch of moonlight. And apparently when they saw this thing, both Wren and Hall together let out a cry of horror. The time for pluralistic ignorance was well over. In the weird darkness, it had been hard to make out this thing, but in the moonlight now, it was freakishly revealed. O'Donnell writes this. Instead of being clothed, the figure was nude. It gleamed a horrible, sinister grey. It had very long arms and legs and a peculiar small and round head. And that wasn't all, because after appearing oblivious to the men just moments ago, it now seemed to finally respond to their shrieks of shock at its appearance. Because when they yelped, this thing snapped its head around and looked straight at them. The account says that the features of this figure were more or less human, and yet it was the expression on the face that truly scared both men. This strange, shockingly tall and spindly traveler had large eyes that were sunken in deep sockets. And as he stared back at them, both Wren and Hall physically shrank back from the gaze, and they described it as, quote, indescribably exultant and devilish. Now, the word exultant is not one we use often, and so don't feel silly if you don't know what it means. But the definition of the word exultant is to show great joy or elation. If you win the lottery, your face may well be exultant. You might laugh or shout or cry tears of joy. This creature had that look in its eye when it saw them. And yet the men combined the word exultant with the word devilish. His face was grinning. It was wildly animated at the sight of them, with a kind of twisted excitement. O'Donnell said that the two men saw the face and were, quote, appalled. They were terrified this thing would suddenly start striding towards them on those long legs, but thankfully it didn't stick around. O'Donnell puts it this way. The figure showed no inclination to dally. Moving onward, still with the same peculiar, lengthy and measured stride, it advanced up the drive, eventually disappearing around a rather abrupt curve. The two men just stood there, shell-shocked at what had just happened. But this was not the end. Because only a few seconds after it had vanished around the curve, the men heard a faint noise, and that noise sounded like what they called a human cry. They waited, breathless, until a few moments later that same human cry came back again, only this time it was far more prolonged and drawn out. They described this cry as bearing with it a ton of suffering quite beyond the ability of words to describe. The forest was plunged into silence once more until it was broken again by a third time that this cry came back, only this time the human wail seemed mixed with some kind of roar. It was a yell of the most piercing intensity, the animal element in it seeming to strive for mastery with the human. And then, as that strange animalistic wailing died away, something crazy happened. The entire forest began to make sounds. The two men heard moaning and strangled cries coming from all around them. These groans and whooping sounds were described as horribly menacing, and amongst them, Hall and Wren could swear they could even hear some kind of hollow laughter. This dreadful, ecstatic chorus from this twisted, dark forest went on for about a minute. Can you imagine being trapped in the forest in this situation? But then suddenly the sound just stopped, and in its place, they could hear the sound of the woodland. A breeze was blowing, and at least for now, the screaming mad woodland that had been so intense just seconds ago was gone. Hall and Wren waited for a moment, frozen to the spot, not knowing what was best to do next, but when it seemed like the sound truly had finished, and with no sign of that horrible skinny man or whatever it was, they both caught each other's eyes and agreed it was time to get the hell out of there, once and for all. And they raced along that roadway. They were hugely relieved to find that the rest of their journey passed without incident. They reached their destination at Greenburgh, and no doubt fell into a nightmare-haunted sleep. Well, it appears that Hall and Wren were not shy about their experience. You see, they ended up telling people in Greenburgh about what had happened to them in the forest the night before. And their bravado was all gone now. They had no intention of going back to investigate what they had seen or heard. But still, word of their encounter got out in the community, and an Irishman called Patrick O'Rourke heard the tale. He was so intrigued by this story, and was particularly curious about their talk of the landlord back at the village inn. Remember, the landlord who said there were reasons the forest was thought to be haunted, but he didn't tell them because he thought the two travelers would laugh at him. Well, O'Rourke realized that they weren't laughing now, and so he decided he would find out for himself. O'Rourke headed to the inn, so he might discover who this ghost or demonic figure was. Well, the landlord could see that O'Rourke was taking this seriously, so he told him about some of the encounters in the haunted wood, including one of his own. The landlord's experience happened 4 years previously. It had been April when he was travelling through that very same valley. It was the early hours of the morning and it was still pretty dark, though he said that dawn had just started to break. The landlord was riding his horse along this roadway. It was a brand new cob that he had bought recently. Cobs are often used for leisure riding or even farm work. They're known to be strong and dependable. Well, the landlord rode his horse along the roadway until he came near to a wooden gate. This was the same gate that Hall and Wren had seen the figure at, the one that led to the White Grange property. It was as he approached this gate that the horse became suddenly agitated. The landlord tried to reassure this horse, but clearly something had seriously spooked her. And so he looked around to see if an animal or predator was nearby. And that's when he saw it, or saw him. A man sitting up by a pathway. He was leaning against the trunk of an elm tree. Now remember, it was still very dark, and so it wasn't easy for the landlord to make this guy out. But he could tell it was a man, at least a very tall-looking man, maybe some kind of vagrant or tramp roaming the road. The landlord cupped his hands around his mouth and hollered over to the stranger. He shouted, "Hello!" Tall man didn't notice at all. He just stayed sitting by the tree. And so the landlord called out a second time, which again was either ignored or not noticed. The landlord was getting concerned that there might be something wrong with this stranger, and being a considerate type of guy, he decided to get down from his horse to go up there to see if there was anything wrong with him, see if he needed some help. But before he could get down from the horse, something happened which shook him and made him not want to get down from the horse at all. All of a sudden, this sitting silent man became instantly animated. He sprang up from where he was sitting with what O'Donnell calls an amazing agility. This is when the landlord finally saw just how different this man was. You see, when he leapt up, it revealed two shocking things. Firstly, the landlord said this man realized that this man was completely naked, and so his private parts were no longer hidden by his knees as he sat. But as well as that, the man was described as gigantic, about 10 to 12 feet in height, is what the landlord estimated. O'Donnell puts it this way: "This was no man at all, but a grim and ghastly caricature of one." You could see the skin was somehow glistening in the dim light, and it was the same color of grey all over. And yet it was the face. It was the face that shocked him the most. He could see it much better now that this figure was standing, and the landlord described the face as a death's head with something frightfully lurid and evil in its big round eye sockets. His new horse freaked out at this and bolted, and the landlord had to battle to rein it in. And when he eventually did, he was able to look back to see where the tall figure was. And that's when he saw this figure crossing the road with what he describes as enormous bounds. And he saw it disappear through the gateway that led to the White Grange. The landlord wasn't the only one to witness this thing either. He told O'Rourke that two travellers had also witnessed what people had begun to describe as the Grey Ghost. Only these two had a rather closer encounter. They'd been walking through the woods when they heard footsteps behind them this time, not in front, but behind. And when they turned round, they saw a shockingly tall grey figure with what was described as unearthly long arms trailing along the ground. They said it was so tall that its head was close to the trees, and when they looked up at it, the skull-like face was grinning down at them. That's how they put it. The two men staggered back in shock, and they both scrambled to escape. Yet this thing was so big, with such a lengthy stride, that it caught up with them with ease. One of the travellers claimed that this figure reached towards him and put its grey hand across his face and touched him. That man shrieked at this and just dropped to the ground, while the other one, the friend, just kept on running, leaving his friend behind him. When the man who was running dared to look back, he was relieved to see that the so-called grey ghost was not pursuing him anymore. But he was worried to see that this thing seemed to be fixated with the other man, curled up on the floor in terror. The friend was too traumatized to do anything but run and run and run again. And eventually he made it out of the forest. He shared what had happened with the locals, and the next morning they sent out a search party to look for the friend who had been touched by this thing. They eventually found him wandering around the woods, frantically gibbering like a man trying to outrun his own trauma. His movements were erratic, his eyes wild, unfocused, fingers twitching. Whatever had happened in the woods that night had shattered his psyche and plunged him into a mental breakdown. He never fully recovered from it. The Irishman Patrick O'Rourke listened to these two stories transfixed. And with this and the story of the two travellers, he was desperate to find out more. So he asked the landlord who the owner of the White Grange was. The landlord told him the name, and so O'Rourke thanked him and left. Within a week, O'Rourke had written a letter to the owner of the White Grange. The owner was astonished by this letter because O'Rourke was seeking permission to stay for a night in the property. Now, from the sounds of it, I think this property must have been empty at the time. Now, there will be some of you saying, that's ridiculous and unbelievable. Who on earth would actively want to stay in a place like that after hearing those accounts? But I know for a fact that there are a sizable amount of you listening to me now who would do exactly the same thing, given the opportunity. In fact, if that is you, could you comment with the words, I would have stayed too, just so we know? After all, how many of you have paid good money to visit and even stay over in reportedly haunted and disturbing places? The paranormal is both repellent and attractive, which is another reason why it is such a fascinating topic. Well, the owner of the White Grange agreed to let O'Rourke stay over, and they arranged a night for the rather unique vigil to take place. O'Rourke was bold for sure, but he wasn't stupid. He arranged for 3 friends, who all lived in the county, to join him that night, and he picked these 3 men because they were tough and not prone to scare easily. I don't know the first names of these 3 men, but I do know their surnames. They were Moore, Ross, and Ventry. Well, the night came for their paranormal expedition, and the 4 men headed out to the White Grange. It didn't take them long to realize they'd chosen a pretty unfortunate night to do this because the weather was appalling. It took an exceptionally bad turn, and so the wind was wild and insane that night. A fierce storm was sweeping across the Hudson River and was battering the woods and the forest on the shore. But they still went for it. They pushed through these elements and found the White Grange house sitting amongst the wildly swaying trees. They opened it up and went inside, the wind screaming at the cracks in the wood. The first thing they did was check the house over. They wanted to make sure that there was nobody hiding, nobody there to fake an appearance of this so-called grey horror. They looked at every inch of the place and were confident that they were, as planned, alone in the house. O'Rourke then chose a room for them all to sit in. He picked a chamber in the house that sat at the end of a corridor. Now, you need to get your head around what this chamber looked like. It had 2 doors in it. One led to the corridor and the other led to a powder closet. If you're not sure what that is, this was a period when wealthy individuals would sometimes project their wealth with elaborate clothes and hairstyles, and they'd sometimes wear powdered wigs. And this powdering process was really quite messy, so certain houses would have a special closet to apply the powder. Whoever owned White Grange was rather well off. Well, the chamber they chose to wait in had 2 pillars coming down from the ceiling to the floor, and between those 2 pillars hung a rather striking divider. It was a large tapestry. O'Rourke said that this tapestry was really quite grotesque looking, but there's no detail in what it depicted, so I just don't know. Well, the 4 friends settled down for their vigil. with the storm raging outside. They set themselves up in a row formation, with O'Rourke facing the corridor, with Moore and Ross facing the hanging tapestry, and then Ventry sat with his eyes on the door to the powder room. And as they sat there, they did start to hear noises coming from the rest of the house. For example, it sounded at one point like someone was walking very quietly along the corridor that was just outside that room. This visitor walked so softly, in fact, that O'Rourke described it as tiptoeing. These gentle steps came closer to the room, and then, for a moment at least, it sounded, and this is crazy, it sounded like those steps had actually entered the room, even though there was nobody there to make the sounds. But anyway, these sounds died away, and to be fair, perhaps the friends could have blamed the old house rattling in the gale force winds for these sounds. Well, they sat waiting and waiting. There was no sign of the grey horror. And so to get more comfortable, some of them decided to lay on their side and their back, and eventually eyelids began folding over, slowly, until all four men had fallen fast asleep. What woke them was the distant sound of the church in the village. It was chiming the hour of 3 a.m. Now, when I read this part of the account, I thought, nah, that doesn't make sense. Churches chime the hour through the day, but here in England, at least, I am not aware of chimes going off in the middle of the night. It would wake people up. And I read that detail and I just thought, yeah, this is some atmospheric flourish, and a sign perhaps that this whole thing is just made up. But just to be sure, I decided to look into the timekeeping traditions of the 1770s. I was quite taken aback to find that a church clock chiming at 3 a.m. is historically accurate for the time. It turns out that back then, church clocks would often strike through both the day and the night to mark the passage of time, especially in rural or isolated communities where other forms of timekeeping were pretty scarce. This makes sense when you think about it. It's not like everybody had watches or even clocks in their home. The chimes were seen as a practical necessity rather than a disturbance. Not only that, I learned that for some communities, the chiming of the clock throughout the darkness of a frightening night could be a symbolic reminder of the passage of time under divine guidance and protection of the church. Remember, these colonies were fearful of both human and inhuman evil lurking in those dark forests. So yes, this detail does ring true, if you pardon the pun. It's also intriguing to note that the clock was chiming at 3 a.m. when they woke up, a time of night often associated with the paranormal, particularly negative experiences of the paranormal. I stayed in a haunted New England mansion a couple of months ago, and I had a rather startling experience at 3 a.m. Well, anyway, the clock chimed, which prompted one of the men, Moore, to climb up to his feet as the others opened their eyes, and he said, "Look, it's morning. Nothing is happening now. And anyway, I have to be at..." It was precisely when he said that, "I have to be at," when his words clipped off, and his tone switched to what O'Donnell called a wild cry of, "Oh my God, there it is!" Moore staggered back and slammed into a wall when he saw it. The rest of them looked across at where Moore was staring in fright, and they saw a sight so hellish that they flung themselves up and away too. Because standing erect between those two pillars in front of the hanging tapestry was an insanely tall man with immensely long arms and legs. The room was still dark. It was 3 a.m., and they had no candle burning at this point. But these men later remarked that this figure's skin was visible enough to see that it was not just grey all over, but there was a strange and lurid streaks of black to the skin too. But it was the face, good Lord. It was horrific. Moore and Ross would later describe it this way. They said, "It was like the face of a corpse, only a corpse that was nearly in the skeleton stage, the skin being drawn tightly over the bones, and the mouth devoid of flesh, and grinning." And from it, they could get a palpable and frankly terrifying sense of intentional hostility. O'Rourke, who had been so keen to see this thing, was now faced with a horror so intense that he couldn't even look at the face. Both he and Ventry later admitted that unlike Moore and Ross, he and Ventry kept their eyes downwards, looking only at the horrible spindly body. They simply did not dare to raise their eyes towards its devilish head. And then, as they looked at it in horror, the feet on its long, naked legs began to move towards them. Moore blurted out in panic, "Strike a light, one of you!" Now, since there were no matches back then, O'Rourke had to frantically hit flint against steel to spark some tinder to light a candle, all while this freakish thing was loping towards them. But he was so used to doing it that he did it fairly quickly. And as soon as the light from the flame lit up the room, the thing that had been standing before them just seconds ago, it was gone. Had it left through the powder room? Would it even fit in there? It certainly hadn't gone out the corridor. Had it moved behind the hanging tapestry? Was it eagerly waiting for them to come round to find it? Well, none of the men were in the frame of mind to find out, because all four of them, without speaking, barreled towards the door to the corridor, and they sprinted down it. And in the middle of the night, they left the white Grange house and the haunted forest in a frantic, desperate hurry. A week passed, and after that horrifying night came what O'Donnell describes as a kind of sequel. You see, Patrick O'Rourke returned to the neighborhood and was so fascinated by his encounter that he decided to go back to the trail just next to the White Grange. Only it appears that he went back in the daytime. Now, some, again, might find the idea of returning to the spot of this traumatic experience unfathomable, but I can understand this. Indeed, other than my New England mansion experience, I've had another more long-lasting experience of something potentially paranormal and inexplicable that happened in 1993, when, weirdly enough, for this story, I saw what looked like a tall, smooth figure crouching on the roof of a large old mansion house. Yet I was surprised at how much I wanted to return to the spot. Even though I had just had the most terrifying experience of my life, I wanted to go back. Heck, part of me wants to even go back now. So O'Rourke returned and was standing there in the valley, thinking about what he had seen, when he suddenly heard rustling nearby. He turned around to see a stranger walking quickly towards him. This was not the tall grey spectre from the other night, but actually he was a very human-looking man with normal length arms. He seemed eager to talk to him. So anyway, this stranger basically said he was passing by the house on that very night. He knew what they were doing, and maybe the guy was nosy or wanted to be involved. We don't know. But whatever the case, he was there at that spot. Maybe he was just passing through. And he said that he had witnessed something on the night the group had been at the Grange. The man pointed to a tall tree at the side of the road, which was close to what looked like a pit. This pit was wide and open, like a hole in the ground, a mouth gaping almost. The man said that on the night of their expedition, he had seen a tall grey figure emerging from that hole, and he saw it striding across the roadway. The stranger said, "You need to watch this pit closely. Be here between 12 midnight and 3 a.m., because that's when it emerges." This man insisted that the reason this valley was haunted was because of this pit. He claimed that the pit ran down into the bowels of the earth, and he claimed that there were holes like this across the world, including places like Brazil or Peru. And he said that these holes attract and harbor a foul and dangerous species of elemental spirits. Well, you're probably getting the measure of O'Rourke by now, because he was keen to test out this man's theory. So O'Rourke did return to that spot later, and he stood watch over that pit between the hours of 12 midnight and 3 a.m. It sounds like he was even alone. Thankfully, the weather was much improved, and apart from the threat of some rain from overhanging clouds, it was actually fine to stand and watch that long. The more he looked, however, as he stared into that gaping hole, the more his flesh began to creep. He said there was a palpable sense of menace emanating from the hole. Was he imagining it? Had he just been primed by his experience and the stranger to assume this hole was to be feared? Well, at some point between those hours, he decided to get closer. And then we very quickly regretted that choice. Because just as he stepped towards the hole, he saw movement inside it. He froze and was horrified to see that same curve of a grey head coming slowly from the shadows in there. And when the shoulders started to emerge from this inky blackness, he came to his senses. He did not wait to see any more, but took to his heels. He ran home, and in the days and weeks after, O'Rourke was very happy to offer his agreement to anyone who would listen. The stranger he had met on the road was absolutely correct, he said. Be it a demon, be it a ghost, be it a witch, or an elemental spirit, this pit was the source of whatever that creature was. Years later, the pit was filled in, and after that happened, something changed in those woods. Despite a string of eyewitness reports, there were no further stories of a tall grey walker striding amongst the trees. The Greenburgh Valley, it appears at least, was haunted no more. And so, what might we make of the strange figure that haunted Greenburgh Valley? What could it have been? Well, firstly, of course, we should consider the natural explanations. And the most simple of them all is to say, the story's just made up. Did O'Donnell simply embellish a story he heard or make it up completely? Alternatively, did O'Donnell frame this story as a ghost encounter when maybe it was some kind of natural encounter? Even like a cryptid case, let's say, like a Bigfoot encounter. This tall, silent form with long arms dragging might remind some of accounts of Sasquatch, particularly when considering the loud animalistic cries heard in the woods. Such stories of cryptids are not uncommon in the forests of northeastern United States. I've had a CD for years called Sierra Sounds, which claims to be the recordings of Bigfoot. Remember when Hall and Wren heard the forest come alive with what they described as appalling sounds, with moaning, plaintive and yet horribly menacing, and with whooping interspersed with hard discordant cries and queer, hollow-sounding, long reverberating laughter. This might sound like hell itself, but could it also be the chorus of unknown animals simply making their natural sounds? I remember staying over at a college once and hearing what genuinely sounded to me like children being attacked or murdered in the forest, until someone told me that that's what foxes sound like in the dead of night. So could they have encountered a natural phenomenon, or even a cryptid? Or was the figure a human? What happens if it was like a recluse or someone suffering from a rare condition whose physical differences were amplified by fear and darkness? All the witnesses' testimony in this case it's laced with fear and revulsion. And it's important to consider the mindset of the time. In the 1770s, anything unusual or outside the narrow understanding of the natural world was often seen as inherently threatening or even evil. Physical differences in particular could evoke deep unease. Disfigured infants, for example, were sometimes believed to be changelings, human children that had been replaced with non-human creatures, and their deformities were seen as a sign of that. Or their deformities were blamed on curses by supernatural forces, the very existence of which could be seen as a sign of divine punishment or demonic interference. And so, to the witnesses, this impossibly tall human man might not have just been a physically different person, but an affront to their understanding of what a man should be. In other words, how much of this was shaped by their own prejudice, their fear of the unfamiliar. Was the grey ghost merely a human, a person whose differences were unfairly twisted into something monstrous by the cultural lens of the time? So if you're a skeptic, there are potential explanations for this. However, there's some elements of this case which are harder to explain naturally. For example, let's say this was a human lost in the woods. The tallest recorded human in history was Robert Wadlow, who stood at 8 foot 11 inches tall. That's a formidable height for sure, but this thing was described as between 10 and 12 feet tall. If there had been a human in the area of that size, surely that person would have become known locally as some sort of novelty. And then there's the gleaming grey skin and the corpse-like facial features, coupled with the lurid streaks of black and the long arms and the legs. This depiction challenges natural explanations. But then I discovered this case of the pale crawler, a large grey entity or humanoid creature that was sighted on a country road in Effingham, Illinois. A figure that appears to have some sort of supernatural element and is shockingly similar to this. Listen to this eyewitness account.
In 2010, me and two friends decided we were going to check out some haunted stuff in the country in Effingham, Illinois. We were told the Caspar Cemetery, deep in the woods surrounded by caves outside Effingham, was a really good place. We headed to Effingham. It's about 1 to 2 a.m., so it's dark. I see something with yellow, glowing eyes off the side of the country road just past the ditch and the headlights. Too short to be a deer, but too big to be a possum or a raccoon. As we get closer, it gets clearer, and I realize what I'm looking at is skinny, hairless, and gray. Human-like, but definitely not human. Crazy as hell looking. It was crouched down. Its arms were incredibly long and looked like it could have been 7 feet tall or bigger standing. I can feel myself getting cold and my heart race and my hair stand on the back of my neck. Complete shock and terror set in, and I can't make a sound. I'm just staring at it. By that time, we are right in front of it, passing it, and it just watches us drive by. It slinks into the dark. Then we all just start screaming, literally freaking the hell out. I was convinced it was a demon for months, but still doubted myself even seeing it. Thinking my mind was playing tricks on me, we went straight home. I couldn't sleep that night.
Now, 6 months later, this witness was sent this famous picture from the internet, which is widely thought to be a fake. But the image still chilled her because she said it was incredibly similar to what they saw that night. She also discovered another witness who claimed to have seen something just like this spectre in the faked photograph. And she asked where this witness had saw their apparition, their thing, and she was gobsmacked when they told her. She saw it back in 2011 in the countryside of Effingham, where they saw it too. Now, Effingham is, almost 1,000 miles away from Greenburgh. And yet there's some weird similarities with what they saw. Jade goes on.
Fast forward to October 2012. I'm on Facebook and I come across a page called Weird Effingham, Illinois. So, of course, I start combing through the entire page and I find reports of sightings around the cemetery of creatures with glowing eyes. This guy we went to school with said that he had a friend that was super into the occult and that she said these are called ghouls. So I went right into researching ghouls. What I find blows my freaking mind. Lore says they are cave dwellers. As I said previously, the Caspar Cemetery is surrounded by caves. They feed on the freshly dead and normally stay close to cemeteries to be close to food. They have been known to show themselves to humans when trying to get close to them to eat. In times where fresh deceased bodies are scarce, I went to the images of them and could only find illustrations, but they looked exactly like what I saw that night. Everything I was reading was falling perfectly in place, lined up perfectly with my experience. I couldn't explain it away.
Now, the Greenburgh account that I'm sharing with you right now is really obscure. I may be wrong, but I don't know of any other YouTube channels or videos that have covered this particular encounter. So it seems unlikely to me that this witness would have learned O'Donnell's account and then somehow replicated it. If she had, I feel like she would have mentioned it and said, oh, this also happened in the past. And yet there really are some striking similarities. The height, the grey skin, the idea of it being human but not quite human, the notion of it dwelling in dark, cold places like the cave or the pit. Well, did Hall, Wren, O'Rourke and the others encounter what is known as a ghoul? Or at least some sort of supernatural, even demonic entity? Its emergence from a pit aligns with folklore about hellish creatures ascending from underground realms. In many traditions, pits or caves are considered gateways to the underworld. It fits the landlord's claim about elemental spirits. Because this thing did defy logic. The silent movement, how do you account for that? Hall and Wren said the figure made no sound as it moved, despite their, quote, abnormally acute hearing in the silence of the forest. Even its massive strides produced no audible footfalls, which would be expected for something so large. The lack of sound, even in a dead, silent forest, suggests that this might not have been a physical entity at all, but some sort of apparition or spirit. It also seemed to be able to vanish, too. Remember when O'Rourke lit a candle and the thing just disappeared? Instantaneous vanishing acts. Well, they're a feature of ghosts and the supernatural, aren't they? No physical being, even a Bigfoot, could simply cease to exist in a second, could it? And then there is the impact on the witnesses. Hall and Wren, as well as the other traveler who was touched by the figure, experienced profound psychological effects, including terror and mental breakdowns. Could these intense reactions point towards more than fear, but a supernatural influence? I've talked about people who have had a surprisingly shocking reaction of impending doom after seeing these sorts of creatures. Was the figure a restless spirit tethered to a violent or tragic past, perhaps tied to the Revolutionary War era, when Greenburgh, like much of the Hudson Valley, saw its share of bloodshed? Could the grey horror's extraordinary physical characteristics, its towering height, its gleaming grey skin, its eerie silence, even suggest extraterrestrial origins? Alien encounters often describe beings with unusual anatomy, otherworldly skin tones, and ability to move or vanish in ways that defy human understanding. What if the creature's unsettling grin and exultant expression might hint at a lack of empathy, or simply an alien intelligence whose motives and emotions are incomprehensible to us? I would love to hear your theories on what this thing could have been, both skeptical and believing. Well, if this story really is based on eyewitness accounts, then these details paint a compelling case that the grey horror could well have been something beyond our natural understanding. Whether ghost, demon, or something else entirely, perhaps that valley really was once a thin place, a bridge between our world and the unknown. But this rather begs a question. Could the area of Greenburgh become open to such presences again? After all, this happened way back in the 1770s, and the claim was that once the pit was filled in, there were no other sightings. Yet hundreds of years of progress and development have carried on since then. Who's to say that some building company hasn't started tearing up areas of that land to build a parking lot or an industrial building or a housing estate? If you live there, your house. If the hole was reopened, might something tall and emaciated and fueled by centuries of hunger crawl out again? Sounds like something from a monster movie, and maybe that's all this is. A story. But outlandish paranormal sightings do often challenge our understanding of reality. And to dismiss them outright may overlook unexplained phenomena that defy conventional explanation. Throughout history, seemingly impossible concepts like the existence of microorganisms or the vastness of space were once considered laughable and absurd until proven true. Eyewitness accounts are subjective, but they often share striking similarities across cultures and centuries. Could that hint at underlying patterns that are worth exploring? By keeping an open mind, we allow room for the discovery of the unknown, recognizing that our understanding of the universe may well be far from complete. And so if you are in the Greenburgh area of New York, or indeed Effingham in Illinois, or anywhere else, I would love it if you could get in touch and tell me if there have been any sightings of strange entities or creatures that might align with what we have heard tonight. But for now, I'd suggest that the next time someone warns you off taking a shortcut through the woods, you might be wise to pay attention. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Trapped in the Haunted Forest, a face-to-face encounter with the Greenburgh Horror. Good night.